popular topics, and then also being discussed heavily in World Economic Forum. But I want to talk about the climate governance first. But how do you define climate governance in 2025? Given that we have a lot of discussion about different style of governance and understanding about climate change, and also the standard of managing climate change from the global south countries and also the advanced countries as well.
Well, I think global governance of climate change in 2025 is at a very interesting inflection point. Because for many countries, global north and global south, climate change is increasingly not only about managing the Earth's emissions to limit temperature change, although of course that's at the core, but it's also about health, it's about economic opportunity, it's about industrial policy to compete with economic competitors. So it's all about all these things, energy security, that are actually core to government's interests. What we're seeing actually is different governments going in very different directions in that. Some relying more on their traditional fossil fuel uses, like my own country, the United States, and others really doubling down on the new energy revolution. And so we're seeing a big change in the global north and the global south on how we think about this problem.
Yeah, but how do you see the effort, especially under the Paris Agreement? What's lacking in terms of Paris Agreement 1, and then we also have President Donald Trump, who says that we're going to start to use oil more currently. Will that hinder all the process that we have throughout the years?
So two things are simultaneously true about the Paris Agreement. First, since the Paris Agreement, countries have lowered emissions by a huge amount. So we're probably on course for something like a 3 or 4 degree temperature change in the century before the Paris Agreement, and now it's more like 2.7, which is way too high, but still a lot lower than it would have been otherwise.
Yeah.
And so to get down to where we want to be, which is well below 2 degrees or even 1.5 degrees, we need countries to step up. And now in 2025 is the moment for them to do their third round of pledges under the Paris Agreement, nationally determined contributions. So we're all looking to see what will happen with this latest pledge. I think 7 countries have pledged so far. Malaysia's not yet amongst them. But we look forward to seeing all countries do this third round.
Now, this is very interesting because you mentioned about Malaysia, and also, I want to bring the discussion into ASEAN, because there's also a discussion not just between ASEAN countries but also at the World Economic Forum about how the standard should be different from developing countries and also advanced countries. Because when you put there's some sort of mold in terms of execution, it's really different from developing countries, because we are developing, and not to say that at the expense of the environment, but we need some sort of space in terms of developing our countries. But how do you view the whole situation? We have different standards in terms of tackling climate change.
Yeah. So I think it's a really important question, because if you look at the objective data, it's absolutely unfair to use the climate as we've used it, where some people, and I say people because within countries it's the richest people who tend to use the most carbon than the poor people. In every country that's true. But also some countries have used a lot more of the atmosphere's space than others. And so if you wanted to equally allocate the climate resources, you have to go back to square one and really change that. And that's a really important part of this problem. But as I was saying before, the reason countries are acting on climate change isn't because they want to do the right thing. Maybe that's part of it for many of them. But it's actually increasingly about making sure they don't have health problems, to make sure they have economic opportunity in these new industries, to make sure they have energy security. And so for those concerns, it doesn't really matter if you're doing it for the right reason, quote unquote, or just for the practical reason. That's increasingly taking over. And so if we were in a world like we were 10 years ago, where the cost of renewable energy was significantly more than the cost of fossil fuel energy, this question really influenced climate policy. But now we're in a world where, for most parts of the world, actually renewable energy is the cheapest and easiest, most secure and cleanest source of energy. And so that question is really flipped on its head.
Yeah, I want to talk about the role of private sectors, especially in Malaysia, because at the end of the day, the public-private partnership is very important in terms of execution of the policies that are being presented by the government. But at the same time, we also have the understanding that the economy has to grow, especially in that side of the world, the ASEAN. But how do we strike a balance between developing our countries, especially in ASEAN, and at the same time ASEAN has like countries different economic background, for instance. But how do we strike a balance in between focusing on industries and at the same time combating climate change? Because in Malaysia, for instance, we have new industrial master plan, which looking at the climate change as well and green action as well. But at the same time, we also have greenwashing taking place because they are being forced to some sort of executing the policies given by the government. But how do you see the greenwashing and how do you strike a balance?
So greenwashing is indeed a common problem around the world, and it used to be very easy to say, we believe in climate change, we believe in saving the forest, we believe in protecting the animals, and no one would really ask you very much. But actually what we're seeing around the world, some new research here at Oxford has been showing increasing regulation around what kinds of claims companies can make, and also what kinds of disclosures they need to make. So in most parts of the world now, companies don't just have to disclose their financial product like they do for investors. They have to disclose their carbon outcomes. They have to disclose what risks they face from climate change. And that means that the market is actually pricing in these things in a much more concrete way. And so if you are greenwashing, another word for that is saying financial fraud, that you're kind of lying to investors about what risks and opportunities you actually face. And as regulators crack down on it, I think we'll see a very different approach to these kinds of claims going forward.
Yeah, we still have a discussion about financing the effort of combating climate change at COP29, for instance, right? But at the same time, can we find tangible solutions and also innovative solutions in that sense? But how do you see the finance side will hinder all the efforts being put in place?
I think the finance side is really critical to getting this right. And actually, we now have a world where, as I said before, the science is very clear, the technology is available, the economic cost of this transition is actually making a lot more sense than it did before, but still we're not moving as fast. One of the biggest barriers is the finance question, that we can't yet find ways to actually channel investment into places where it's going. There's all sorts of problems, but one of the biggest ones is governments are still spending about 7 times more subsidizing dirty energy than they are investing in clean energy. So when the field is weighted 7 to 1 against you, it's quite hard to make the private sector investment to make money on this kind of thing. So we need smart policy. We need to kind of work through these very complicated subsidy issues and policy frameworks. But if we do that right, then the finance will flow. It's not the question of not having the money. It's a question of creating the incentives that make the money flow.
Yeah, but for businesses as well, because when I start a business and considering green action in their business strategy and business model, at the same time they need money in terms of dealing with the banking and all that. But a lot of conventional banking, they are looking at ROI at the end of the day. So of course they can consider, but then every day maybe they're still stuck with the traditional business of doing things.
Yeah.
But how do you see that the banking system, private sector especially, looking at green financing, especially in the other side of the world, which is ASEAN as well? Do they understand, and is there any willingness in terms of banking providing more money and financing toward green business?
So I think there's a lot of interest in the financial sector and investing in these kinds of opportunities. One of the big challenges, though, is scale. So for a lot of banks, they need a kind of big project to make it worth their while to do the due diligence and to see if it's going to make a return for them. And many times renewable energy projects are a bit different from fossil fuel projects in that they're smaller in scale. You have industrial scale ones, you also have a lot of smaller ones. And so one of the key things we need to do is to bundle together different projects to make them more like a kind of commodity, a kind of financial standard product like a home mortgage or something that you can package into something larger that then helps investment to flow. So the scale issue is one of the key challenges to figure out.
But are we on the right track in terms of that?
We need to speed up. I think there's a lot of progress on these kinds of issues. For example, we've seen a lot of private sector investment following from the United States, even despite Trump, the Inflation Reduction Act, which allowed for companies to get a tax credit for some of the investments they're making. You saw then private investment take off after that, right? So this is the kinds of simple things that if you get the incentives right, you can actually make a difference. Now, the hard part is not knowing that. Every government kind of knows that. The hard part is building the plan, the political support, and the implementation capacity to actually deliver that. So that's the hard work of implementation that we're into now.
Yeah. In terms of policy, we have on the international level, Paris Agreement or other agreements as well, but and then we have to bring it down to the national level and also the state level. This is about a decentralization effort as well. But how do you see the flow, especially from the South global countries?
So I think one of the challenges for climate policy is that everything basically causes climate change or is affected by climate change. So you can't address it in one single ministry sitting in the central government. It has to be something that's mainstreamed across the transportation department and the agricultural department and the forest people and the transportation people, and also not the federal government, the national government, but also regional governments, local communities. It all has to come together. And so one of the big challenges I think we have here is the need to invest in government's capacity to do that. We have a lot of international support that goes for something called capacity building.
Right.
But too much of this money is spent on consultants or PowerPoint presentations. And what governments actually need is someone to work in their office, right? And to actually do the work of putting together projects. Like that's the real, slightly boring but important part of what we have to do now.
So political challenges, especially in, I would like to focus about ASEAN because political situation in ASEAN is quite unique in that sense, and then we are still stuck of being because they wanted to win election. So it's always about popular decision being made. But how do we strike a balance in philosophical area in terms of win election and also at the same time doing the right things to combat climate change?
Well, I was very happy to see last year the largest country in ASEAN, Indonesia, had elections. Obviously, people paid a lot of attention to this, and the outcome was more continuity than change. But you saw the new government in Indonesia take the decision right after they won the election to announce a very ambitious timeline for phasing out coal power plants in Indonesia, which is a huge source of energy for Indonesia. So I think you can see political incentives flowing in that direction. Now, the Indonesian government has a big challenge now to deliver that plan, but the fact that they announced it shows the political support for that. And why? I mean, there's a lot of reasons why people are interested in this. They breathe air that's really harmful for them and their children. And that's a political winner if you frame it in the right way.
And as for Malaysia, for instance, we have a lot of investment in terms of data center, and it requires a lot of energy consumption and water consumption as well. And we keep having this conversation that we should generate it more green and also cleaner energy, but at the same time, Malaysia is still struggling in terms of that. But how do you see that countries with countries who are actually attracting all these data centers should manage and strike a balance in terms of energy generating for data centers?
Well, this is the huge economic opportunity that I think people are really racing for. So every big tech company that wants to do AI is seeking a huge amount of power for it. And they really, really want that power to be stable and reliable and green. And so if you are trying to sell power and sell data centers to Apple or Google or Tencent or any of the big companies that are rushing into this realm, they're looking to pay a price premium for green energy. So countries that have the natural endowments, wind, sun, geothermal, hydro, whatever they are, and can turn them into energy are going to win this economic race. So I think for Malaysia, there's a huge opportunity here. And Malaysia has made great progress recently, for example, by allowing the export of renewable energy to have a big client in Singapore. It's a huge money maker for the government and for the people. So this is, I think, the model to follow. How to do it? There's many things that need to come into place to make kind of clean energy revolution take off. One is making sure it's easy to permit. Right, incentives are there, finding space for them. These are all kind of complicated implementation questions, so it's not like a silver bullet you say, here's the switch, now you flip it on. It's more bringing together communities, finding support, having a plan. But I think I'm very optimistic about what Malaysia can achieve in this way, because there's a huge market there, and Malaysia has all the resources it needs to succeed. Yeah,
we have the ASEAN grid in terms of energy transition and also energy generation. But at the same time, we are facing with the world that is changing rapidly in terms of political and also other stuff as well. When we have Trump in the US who believes that we should use more fossil fuel, right? But how do we strike a balance? How do we do this without interference of the superpower that be in terms of the understanding of how do we combat climate change?
So I think most countries are looking at what's going on in the United States, which is my own country where I come from, and thinking, this isn't a really good way to run a country where you switch every few years from one policy to another. And I think you have to look more deeply at what the economic transformation is doing. So under the first Trump administration, renewable energy in the United States increased hugely. It went up a huge amount. So did oil and gas. But oil and gas also increased during the Biden administration, right? Because the United States is having a very successful fracking-led oil and gas production expansion. So the United States has its own pathway based on its own resources. But does that actually affect what Malaysia should do? I don't think so, because I think Malaysia has a very clear interest in driving to the head of this transition because you have so many resources, renewable resources, because you have this huge economic opportunity to become a manufacturer of these sort of new technologies and to have a really valuable role in the value chain. And if you look at that, why would you give that up?
I spoke to Prof. Yunus in World Economic Forum. They talk about a lot of things about ASEAN, especially to have a different standard in terms of developing ASEAN, and also the objectives that we want to achieve, and that includes the energy transition as well. But how do you see that we should have, especially the developing countries in ASEAN, should have different mold in that sense and standard in terms of combating climate change and the way we do business and development? Should we have a different standard in terms of green transition for ASEAN, for developing countries, and will advanced countries, especially in the Euro and also the Western countries, understand the needs of doing this?
So I think every country should look very carefully at its own cost-benefit analysis. What do we get from investing more in the green transition? What do we need to make that successful? And I think that's what the new structure of the Paris Agreement allows countries to do. They set their own nationally determined contributions, as they're called. So no one's forcing any country to do something it doesn't want to do. And so I think what is really exciting, though, is how these new economic opportunities that are coming out of the green transition are drawing countries in. You know, countries have this big ability to transition. They also know that the risks of climate change are extremely severe for a country like Malaysia. This is really an existential question for many communities in the country. And so by having this kind of balance of opportunity and risk, I think most countries are finding their way to faster action. Now, we need to do more. And so the hardest things are around getting rid of the dirtiest sources of energy like coal, and not creating long-lasting assets that might be risky in the future. So that's, I think, where a political commitment is needed, a long-term vision. But the opportunity is so strong, I can't see any way to move away from it.
You mentioned about the Indonesia of post-election, especially, and the Perubahan. It's very interesting, but how do you see the political will, especially from the other side of the world, in terms of having the right policies, and at the same time, the public sectors as well, not just greenwashing and doing things just to please the government in terms of having correct policies, but how do we do actually the right things that have tangible impact?
I think one of the most exciting examples I saw on climate action last year actually came from Pakistan.
Right.
Pakistan has a very underdeveloped energy grid. So people don't have access to power when they need it for lights, for refrigeration, for air conditioning, all the things that people need. Last year, Pakistan imported something like 13 gigawatts of solar panels from China. Not because of any government program, not because of any international agreement, because people really needed a solution for the desperate power lack that they faced. And so this is, to me, a really promising sign, because it shows that we're now at a point where clean energy is just so attractive. It's providing a development solution without any kind of intervention from the government. Now, of course, we got there because of a lot of government policies and support to get to that point. But this is, to my mind, is a crystal clear example of how we can now put aside this old thinking that there's some sort of trade-off between development or economic growth and climate transition. Those are actually now the same thing.
My last question: but how do you see the effort of combating climate change from advanced countries and from developing countries as well? I don't know, 10 years down the road.
I think we are now, for all the reasons I've said, at this kind of energy transition tipping point. But there are two big questions I think we still have to really focus on to get right. One is, how do we actually dial down fossil fuels?
Right.
So we're very good at adding new things. We're adding a lot of new renewable energy. And over time, of course, that will displace demand for fossil fuels. We actually have to speed up the phasing down and ultimately phasing out of coal, of oil, of gas. And that's quite costly, right? We have to think about how the people who depend on those kinds of economic resources get a bright future, how some of the shareholders, which include also our governments sometimes, how they have a transition that makes sense. And so that's a really important piece of it. The other piece I think we're not nearly doing enough on is adapting to the impacts of climate change and making our economies and our societies more resilient. For example, for floods, droughts, heat waves, fires. Look at what's happening in Los Angeles this week, where a rich city is really struggling with a very predictable and predicted impact of climate change. And so we need to do much more on that side as well.
But do you see that the governments around the world understand the planetary health, essentially have more lot of consequence to the poverty, for instance? Do you think that the government understands that?
I think it's easy for governments to see the connections. What's hardest for them to operationalize them because of kind of siloed thinking. So, for example, one of the most biggest costs almost every government faces, especially in aging societies, is the healthcare spending. One of the biggest drivers of healthcare spending is things like chronic diseases like diabetes or cancer, many of which are connected to air pollution, many of which are connected to unsustainable food systems. And so if we had more prevention in our for example, reducing air pollution or reducing the nasty chemicals we put into food, we actually would save a huge amount of money in the future. And the long-term savings would be net positive on aggregate. But governments aren't always very good at putting together those pieces because you have the health ministry over here, the finance ministry over here, the environment ministry over here. So what you really need is leadership from prime ministers, from presidents, from all politicians who have kind of see these connections to draw that together.
Right. Lastly, the downside risk that you see in terms of combating climate change moving forward that we should look out for?
I think we should be very worried about the political impacts of climate change. Right. I think as we see a world that warms more and more, we'll have impacts like the fires in Los Angeles this week and last week, like floods, like heat waves. And in that kind of world, people will have a very natural and understandable need for immediate protection.
Right.
And so they'll be less long-term in their views, they'll be less generous in their thinking about the rest of the world, they'll be very focused on protecting themselves.
Yes.
And so as we have more and more climate change, that's a really dangerous set of political conditions to create, because in a world where everyone's trying to just protect themselves, actually we lose the ability to have more efficient solutions, which are the global long-term prevention that is really at the core of stopping this problem.
All right. Prof, thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you.
I really appreciate your insights. That's all for this summer. I hope to see you again.
Thank you so much for coming.
Di dalam setiap berita yang dibawa, konteks amat penting. Cara kita mendapat berita kian berubah. Melalui media sosial maupun saluran digital yang lain serta kaca TV. Kami sentiasa membawakan yang tergempar dan terkini.
Kita buat sesuatu yang berbeza.
Berteraskan ajuan verifikasi yang diamalkan supaya setiap fakta adalah sahih. Daripada analisis pelbagai sudut yang mendalam, laporan-laporan khas dan perbincangan yang membina negara. Inklusif, suara rakyat kami ajukan. Keseimbangan persepsi kami pastikan. Kerana setiap cerita mempunyai impak yang tersendiri dan perlu dibawa dengan penelitian yang terperinci. Pastikan Astro AWANI menjadi pilihan anda tidak kira di mana sahaja anda berada. Saluran berita paling dipercayai di Malaysia.
Tak ada apa yang lebih kejam dari masa. Sifat masa adalah mengambil, tapi masa juga memberi. Aku dah tekad nak berperang dengan takdir.
Walau apa pun yang jadi, kena patah balik.
Reversi. Sewa dan stream on demand atau sila ke saluran 480.
Assalamualaikum warahmatullahi.
Assalamualaikum Kelantan. 14 Februari ini, semua dijemput datang beramai-ramai ke Masjid Al-Sultan Ismail Petra. Kita imarahkan tazkirah malam Jumaat dengan asatizah yang dihormati.
Ilmu, iman dan inspirasi.
Dan mengukuhkan ilmu kafah bersama geng duit. Sertai pelbagai aktiviti istimewa untuk seisi keluarga. Indahnya lain macam, mari meraih keberkatan.
Alright, thank you for tuning into Niaga AWANI. And as we wrap up 2024, Malaysia is expected to stand on firm economic ground, with economists forecasting GDP to grow between 4.3 to 5% this year, and backed by several factors, including a favourable labour market. And looking ahead towards the government's plan to introduce initiatives aimed at high-value activities and also economic diversification, the competition for professional talent recruitment and retention is also expected to intensify alongside salary expectations at the same time. And while businesses and organizations can look forward to various growth possibilities, how can they navigate labor market dynamics and shifting motivations that will become more complex in 2025 this year? So to discuss further, we have the Right Authority joining me in the studio this morning, Marie Lee, Associate Director, Robert Walters Malaysia, wearing red in conjunction with Chinese New Year this year. How are you?
I'm very good, Nabilah. Thank you for having me this morning. happening.
Amazing, amazing. Thank you so much for joining me this morning. First of all, perhaps you could start with the recent agreement of Johor Singapore Special Economic Zone, JSSEZ, which is expected to create around 20,000 skilled jobs in 5 years, which is a significant development, honestly. And given that 47% of organizations already face difficulties with the talent pipeline, how do you foresee this initiative influencing Malaysia's workforce dynamics, and what should companies be doing now to prepare?
Perfect. Thank you, Nabilah. I think first and foremost, with this Johor Singapore Economic Free Zone, I think what's most important at this point of time is this establishment obviously is going to create significant opportunity for talents in Malaysia and Singapore. In other words, it's going to have a very big transformative impact on talent pipeline in Malaysia. The focus area of this Johor Singapore
Special Economic Zone?
Yeah, Special Economic Zone is going to be in certain areas which includes manufacturing, technology, logistic finance, and also green energy, right? In other words, the key roles that will be coming out will be, advanced manufacturing application, to using advanced technology in manufacturing sector, cyber security and data analytics is definitely an area, where we will see more and more demands in the talent pipelining, so it's very important for companies to basically take the right step in upskilling the current talent pipeline that we are having. It's also very important for us to basically be very intentional, with the steps that we are taking to build pipeline for the right talents that are coming out for the future market. So I think all in all, we need to ensure that talent pipelines we don't only have a large talent pipeline, for the future economy of Malaysia, but I think more importantly, we have the right talent, right, for the future economy of Malaysia.
Amazing. And like I mentioned earlier, those are the sectors that's on the pipeline that we focus more when it comes to this collaboration within JSSEZ, which includes manufacturing and also digitalization and automation, and they are no longer just buzzwords, right? So they're reshaping industries at an unprecedented pace, and with 45% of organizations struggling with a lack of industry experience among candidates, what practical steps should companies take to close this gap and ensure they are future ready towards these talents?
Thank you, Nabilah. I think companies, I think looking at the hiring trends with companies moving forward right now, I think a lot of companies are taking an approach with more I guess, holistic view of hiring, right? So it's no longer hiring based on paper or based on certificates moving forward, right? I think a lot of companies, if you look at it today, we are hiring based on skill, So what it means is that the skill that the candidates have today, right, might not necessarily be something that they can develop in the future. So I think something that companies can start doing is basically hiring more on a skill-based approach, which means during interview, I think hiring managers can start looking into maybe asking more solution-based question, right? To understand whether this talent has a future in terms of developing a talent where the company needs, right? So I think a lot of companies are looking for talents not only to do the job currently, but it's also the future of the company, right?
Whether more soft skills. Maybe.
Yeah, more soft skills, that's right? So whether this candidate has problem-solving skill, right, to help a company during crisis, whether a candidate is able to have the right thought process, right, during interview. So I think that is probably an area where a company can start looking at to pipeline for the right talent in the future.
But speaking of which, there's always a challenge when it comes to hiring and also retaining a talent, which there's always a delicate balance between meeting salary expectations, at the same time maintaining financial sustainability. And with 85% of organizations planning salary increases, but 63% struggling to meet these expectations. So how should companies approach compensation strategies to stay attractive yet financially prudent?
Yes. I think I think it's an ongoing discussion with meeting candidates' expectation and also employers' budget to obviously manage business sustainability, right, in a business. So what that means is that I think companies, employers can start looking into basically working on a more modern approach when it comes to salary and also a package of what employers, right, can do. So for example, Nabilah, I think one thing that we can look at is although yes, 77% of the candidates through our survey say that remuneration package is very important, but at the same time, I think a lot of candidates are also putting a lot of emphasis into work-life balance, hybrid working arrangements, and also areas where people ask for mental health support. So I think instead of only looking at package as something that is the main factor, I think moving forward in this modern society, I think employers can start looking at, offering candidate a more holistic package instead of only talking about remuneration package, which is important, but I think at the same time, work-life balance is important, culture is also very important.
Basically, the other stuff other than just salaries, such as bonus, medical benefits, that's also important, to actually attract talents.
That's right.
But right now we have the Madani Budget 2025 that was introduced last year in October. There were several initiatives aimed at boosting high-value activities and also economic diversification. And given the optimistic hiring outlook revealed in your survey, Salary Survey 2025, how do you anticipate these policies influencing higher trends and also organizational strategies at the same time?
So yes, we do anticipate a new wave of government policies and also obviously government initiative, in the year 2025. So obviously this will be driving a new shift of economic development, alongside with this initiative. We will be looking at specializations, moving towards more digitalization and also skill sets in the area of infrastructure development. So we're likely to see high value roles increase, such as digital capability requirements and various specialization. So this development will play a key role in opening doors for upskilling candidates. Area in digital transformation and also creating job opportunity, driving demand and skilled talents. Another part that maybe I want to emphasize a little bit more, it's these days in recruitment, a trend that we actually see quite that's up and coming is basically companies are very interested to do marketing intelligence. Obviously with new initiative and new approach in the new business world, I think companies are now doing a lot of market intelligence study to actually understand what are the talents in the market, like where do they sit, right, in terms of salary remuneration, introduction of work flexibility. I think companies are more and more interested in what can they do to keep up with the modern working world. Yes.
But now let's look at the standpoint of the employers itself. With more than half organizations planning to expand their hiring, it's crucial to identify as well where the biggest opportunities lie and which sectors do you foresee experiencing most significant growth going towards, perhaps now we are in 2025, we're moving towards net zero 2050, and so which sectors do you foresee that experience the most significant growth, and what ripple effects might this have on the broader job market, perhaps?
I think I will start with the industry that we are looking at having obviously a high demand of talents coming in. I think the few industry that I can name is probably tech, IT, e-commerce and logistics. I think the e-commerce world is still continuously growing, right? So logistics is an industry where it's supporting the e-commerce industry because obviously you need logistics to fulfill the order. I think sustainability and renewable energy. I think we see a lot of EV cars coming up, and also obviously financial services. So to name it, these are few industry that are actually growing in the market. So I think as you can imagine, these are up and coming, right? In terms of, and it's new to the Malaysian economy. Although we are quite familiar with it, but I think in terms of skill set of talent pipelining in the market, I think it's still quite new, meaning that the skill sets that are required in this area can be still quite niche in terms of looking for the talent. So in other words, companies have to continue, right, to upskill candidates and maybe invest in candidates for them to attend work with educational institution to maybe attend programs where they are able to upskill their skill in the area of the job market's demand, right? To meet the job market's demand.
Correct.
Yes.
And you mentioned about tech earlier. I want to go specifically and go deep into semiconductor, where Malaysia is making big strides in semiconductor industry and attracting significant investments. And given that 77% of employers already offer training, also development courses, how can they ensure their upskilling initiatives actually align with the evolving demands of high-tech industries? Especially right now we have AI and a lot of coming in the next future. So how can we actually meet those demands? And also at the same time, the technological advancements evolves very fast, right? So how can we ensure that the upskill is aligned between the fast pace of these advancements?
Yes, I think that's a very good question, Nabilah. I think organization these days, I think every time when we go out for client meeting with our client, I think one thing that they speak about is how are we able to upskill their candidate within their business at the moment to meet obviously the demand of the AI and cybersecurity. So I think one thing is companies can start looking into having partnership linkages with educational institutions and also obviously government institutions to basically tailor their programs, right, into upskilling candidates and maybe reskilling candidates programs as well, right, to obviously eventually meet the specific demands and skill set. I think the other part is I think organization can also look into getting feedback from candidates on which area of development they are ready to learn, because it's a lot about also interest of the candidate to learn about the business and the area of growth, right? So I think if the candidate, I think there's a lot of candidates these days who are very willing to actually
learn.
They are very willing to actually upskill and also go beyond the job scope they're doing. They are very willing to learn. But I think it's the opportunity to learn. So I think coming back to what I mentioned earlier as well, Nabilah, I think it's companies really wanting to invest in their current talent pool as well.
That's a good point over there. And I want to give a specific example. Right now we have the rise of EV, and which means at the same time the rise of entry of Chinese car brands into Malaysia market, which is intensifying competition across the board as well. So with 68% of organizations already citing talent and competition as a key challenge, how do you see this affecting the talent acquisition strategies of non-national car makers right now?
I think with the new business investment that Malaysia is having, I think with car makers from China in specific coming into Malaysia, I think it has changed the automotive market landscape a little bit. So we are talking about candidates now from maybe international not international, but more Western car makers are now maybe moving into more Asian car businesses for a career. So I think businesses at the end of the day, new businesses will eventually drive competition in the market. Sometimes I think people say it's healthy competition. I think so, that's good. But I think as businesses strive, I think the ripple effect is that then a lot of companies will then now source for the top talents, right? And the top talents then now become in demand. So I think be it automotive or other industry, Nabilah, I think at the end of the day, I think it's looking beyond the competition. Even though there's competition, I think the company have to focus on what the company can do for themselves, meaning, let's just say, is career progression. I think a lot of candidates these days, they put a lot of emphasis on career progression. How far they can go within a company. Are they able to grow within the business? I think the sense of belonging. And I think with sense of belonging, it comes culture, right? I think culture is a very big thing now, right? So I think companies can start now also looking into employing leaders that can basically build good culture, because it's a very important part of a lot of business today. I think a lot of employers these days, beyond remuneration package, they stay for culture. They stay because they don't want to drag themselves to work. They want to come to work with a peace of mind, right? So I think culture is definitely an area where companies should continue to put a lot of emphasis on to retain candidates in today's competitive market. Yes.
So what we can say here right now is for job seekers, or perhaps if you want to stay in this competitive industry or world, you have to upskill yourself to meet the job demands and also future-proof your career. And for employers as well, be ready to invest to make sure your employees are ready for the future with these technological advancements of AI, semiconductor, and also automations. So I would like to say thank you so much to Marili, the Associate Director of Robert Walters Malaysia, for sharing your insights and for your time as well on Niaga Awani. And I think that's all for now. You can find this whole conversation on all of our social media platforms, and that includes astroawani.com. Till next time.
Merentasi Laut Cina Selatan hingga ke puncak Kinabalu, kami bawakan laporan ringkas, padat dan komprehensif. 5 minit Awani Sabah Plus setiap Khamis dan Jumaat 8.25 malam hanya di Astro Awani.
Sign the resignation letter and you are completely become my housewife.
Kifarah mendatang.
Dia dapat apa yang dia idamkan. Okay, Beza. Aku nak kau terus semangat, Syah.
Kakak, abang Is pukul akak lagi Siapa tu?
Pilihan yang memakan diri.
Syah, tolong Mr. Chen pukul Abang jangan berpenjara.
Jangan pergi ke Jamara.
Jangan yang bahaya, ya.
Adakah konflik ini bakal berakhir?
Kau buat apa dengan Is?
Minggu akhir, curang tanpa niat di Astro Ria dan Astro Go.
Malaysia sebenarnya berada di kedudukan kedua terburuk di dunia berkaitan keseimbangan hidup dan kerja.
LRT3 sudah akan mula beroperasi suku ketiga 2025. Kerja-kerja fizikal dan penstrukturan sudah mencecah 95%.
KPM sebenarnya sedang memperincikan cadangan untuk menyediakan allowance kos sara hidup tingkatan 6.
Melibat urus antara umat Islam dan agama lain penting supaya dapat mengelakkan ataupun membawa kepada Islamofobia.
Kementerian Dalam Negeri memberi lampu hijau supaya pengesanan dadah dilakukan terhadap pengguna vape.
Tahap integriti warga polis Diraja Malaysia PDRM masih membimbangkan walaupun peringatan dan amaran diberikan berulang kali.
Anwar menegaskan bahawa negara ini tidak mengiktiraf Israel secara de jure meskipun keberadaan negara itu di peringkat antarabangsa.
Malaysia tidak akan meminda peta sempadan maritim dan tetap mempertahankan kawasan dan kedaulatan negara di Laut Cina Selatan.
Hi, welcome to ASEAN Kita with me, Farhan Hakimi, and today we will discuss and dive into the very foundation of ASEAN, the three pillars that uphold its vision and drive its progress. Well, the political, security, economic, and socio-cultural pillars, which are more than just frameworks. They shape the way we navigate challenges and also foster cooperation and build a future that is both resilient and inclusive. But how do these pillars function in practice, and what role do they play in charting ASEAN's next course? Well, let's unravel the significance and decode their impact right here on ASEAN Kita with our guest, Dr. Nur Nirwandi Matnordin, Security and Political Analyst at the University Technology Mara UiTM Center for Media and Information Warfare Studies. Good morning. Thank you for joining, Doctor.
Morning.
Well, let's try to give a clear comprehension on these pillars. Why are these three pillars essential to ASEAN's framework, and how do regional leaders actively leverage them in shaping policies and cooperation across member states?
ASEAN is a very unique establishment. The foundation of ASEAN lies into lots of factors. Among the factors are the elements that constitute what ASEAN are made of. And of course, this pillar inclusive of ASEAN political security community, ASEAN economic security, and ASEAN social cultural community. It's important to drive ASEAN into a certain value into the regional stability, diplomacy elements, economic security, the non-interventions policy, because this is a foundation. So it becomes a fundamental element for the ASEAN to move forward and how to look into the ASEAN establishment. And in regard of this context, with the global disparity of the economics, with the element that we have in digital divide, the cybersecurity issues, and all the elements, there are also some elements that can be included as ASEAN positive element. And of course, ASEAN's party countries like Malaysia, Singapore, Thailand are the middle power of the global player. So these also bring a new valuations of ASEAN. But in order to look into that, moving forward into the ASEAN establishment, into ASEAN foundations, what can ASEAN do in the current situations, in the global perspective, the regional perspective, it's important for ASEAN to be driven by these strategic pillars. And all these pillars have all their fundamentals element in it. For example, if we look into ASEAN political security community, to look into the stability of ASEAN, to make sure that ASEAN's diplomatic non-intervention element, the ASEAN mechanisms in putting up peace, democratic society, the element of human security being valued in ASEAN community is something that look into a very transactional process, Farhan. So this bring into a new valuation of ASEAN. Important for us also to understand in the context of this diplomatic element, the unilateral, bilateral, and multilateral ASEAN element. ASEAN basically is much more towards the unilateral, not more like unilateral as more the superpower, but much more towards the bilateral and multilateral assistance cooperation between the ASEAN countries. So this level up ASEAN into important regional global players, and of course the middle powers in ASEAN countries, they are pushing forwards the economy and stability of ASEAN. But however, there are some challenges that we might facing ahead. But it is important to drive ASEAN to these three basic pillars of ASEAN political security community, ASEAN economic community, and of course ASEAN social cultural community, because this will drive ASEAN into what are to maneuver ASEAN in regards what are the circumstances, the global politics, the regional value. However, ASEAN need to be united, and this is important where ASEAN have all the elements of championships annually to make sure that ASEAN focus, ASEAN preserves, ASEAN identity is maintained regardless what are the current global situations that we have today.
Well, let's unravel one of the three pillars that we have, ASEAN Political Security Community, or APSC. If you look at it, ASEAN follows the principle of non-interference, which means countries don't interfere in each other's internal affairs. But modern threats like cybercrime, terrorism, and border disputes affect multiple countries at once. So given this, how does the APSC reconcile sovereignty with the need for collective security, especially in transnational crises such as cyber threats and terrorism?
It is an interesting discussion, because when we talk about this non-intervention policy of the ASEAN, of course, it talks about the elements of conflicts, because this non-intervention policy have bring ASEAN to move forwards in looking into the element that first, of course, status in the Article 2 of United Nations, the element of sovereignty by a state nation that must not be intervened, must preserve or must held a form of sovereignty over all the issues, element of threats, and any coercive decisions or process by other countries in the world. But however, these elements of non-intervention have its advantages and disadvantages. The advantages, of course, it brings the stability, the democratic peace element, it brings the regional stability in the nations, it brings into the values of ASEAN sovereignty, that all the members of ASEAN respected decisions of ASEAN members. But in regard of some certain situations, before we move into the much broader accounts such as digital divide, the cyber crimes, and the transnational issue, we are talking about the issue, for example, in issues of Myanmar and Rohingya and the junta systems of administrative military system that we have in Myanmar currently. So this is something that has become, not to say it's a burden to ASEAN, but because of these non-intervention policies, ASEAN always resorted to this diplomatic mechanism, and public diplomacy is seen as the best elements to restore and to resolve any form of conflict in ASEAN. But giving into this particular process, so it also become derailed in some situations, and of course, it some extended the process of the conflict because of this ASEAN non-intervention policy. However, in some context of cybersecurity mechanisms, in the foundations of all the transnational crimes, I think the ASEAN has moved forward. ASEAN is basically collaborative, all the elements of interregional peace security. In fact, ASEAN come out into a certain, it's still in the context of not what we call being directors or be associated with some certain act of law, as what we have in the EU, Artificial Intelligence Acts and so on. But now ASEAN is also looking into its own form of artificial intelligence threats, cyber community, cyber crimes, community threats, and all the cybersecurity foundation, but it still fall into that non-intervention policy. But in terms of cooperation, I think ASEAN's are doing very well, and ASEAN to emulate some much more forward advanced country. For example, our country like Malaysia, we have to look into, for example, for Thailand, they have their own artificial intelligence cybersecurity crime unit to look into all the exercise, all the complaints, all the security probability risks that might happen due to the cybersecurity and artificial intelligence process in the current and the future. So this is something that ASEAN have to emulate and have sent to brought back into some certain discussion to make it much more regionalized and to make it much more be shared of this common value, particularly looking into all the transnational crime. But again, the non-intervention policy is something unique on the ASEAN mechanisms of looking into the sovereignty of the state. But somehow or other, it also bring into some setback and disadvantages to restore some importance and to push into some important decision, particularly involving the physical conflicts, democratic conflicts, such as what happens and what we have now in the Myanmar, the Rohingya issue, the junta elements in Myanmar. And this is something that worries ASEAN, but this ASEAN again have to focus and to look forward on how to make sure that this non-intervention policy somehow already also brings some significant value in other form of cooperation, such as cybersecurity, artificial intelligence threat, and of course, the incoming transnational values. And this also look into the ASEAN particular process on how to deal with the China elements of South China Sea. And this is again bringing to some interruptions in the ASEAN, looking into on how ASEAN collaboratively can restore the sovereignty in the units of ASEAN, rather than looking to by these individualizations of the state, looking to unilateral interests of the state, but have to be in terms of multilateral sovereignty, unity of ASEAN, to forego the element of non-intervention at some point to look into much broader focus, particularly involving the image, identity ASEAN, and of course the stability of ASEAN, such as the South China Sea disputes by China, who have claims that is basically that's not relevant or irrelevant against the UNCLOS Foundation. But again, this is something that ASEAN have to look to move forward, particularly in the ASEAN 2025 chairmanship by Malaysia, which include inclusivity and sustainability.
And of course, Dr. Hassan makes decisions based on consensus, meaning all 10 member states must agree before taking actions. But some might argue, while this helps maintain unity, it can also slow down responses to urgent issues like the Myanmar crisis. So to what extent has ASEAN's consensus-based decision-making hindered or facilitated timely responses to geopolitical tensions in the region?
Whatever it takes for ASEAN to move forward, we have to become in a form of bloc. So this is where when we have ASEAN chairmanship by annual basis, and it's supposed to be Myanmar by 2026, but of course I think the consideration have to be looked. In fact, much of the ASEAN countries are reconsidering whether ASEAN Myanmar will be the next ASEAN chairmanship due to the political crisis that we have in Myanmar currently. But again, in the form of decision making, in the form of getting consensus, this is what we call the beautiful part of the ASEAN inclusivity and sustainability, as what we call the theme of ASEAN Chairmanship 2025 by Malaysia this year. And looking into this consideration, wherever the form of discourse of actions, ASEAN summit that we have in Indonesia 2023, we have in Brunei in 2024, of course we have Malaysia in 2025. ASEAN really are looking forward into building up the foundations of bloc, looking into part that. And of course, COVID-19 also give us a good lessons on how ASEAN also need to have their own CDC, contact disease center, the vaccines implementations, vaccine mechanism, laboratory to come up with their form of vaccination, rather than the form of ASEAN dependent to all the superpowers to reopen powers of bloc. We need that correlation, of course, for sure. ASEAN need a form of concession, but moving forward, ASEAN need to have a form of stability. Therefore, there must be a form of leadership ASEAN, and all the middle powers in the ASEAN countries such as Indonesia, Thailand, Malaysia, and Singapore have to collaboratively bring ASEAN forward, because we have some little bit of elements. The consensus is quite sharp, it's quite okay. But in the context of some other countries that have lagged behind, for example, digital device, cybersecurity element for countries like Laos, Myanmar, Cambodia, which is something that picking up in the context of technological elements, putting up in form of technology and of course economics apparatus in the countries of the ASEAN multilateral cooperation. But this also needs some form of consensus. Therefore, ASEAN need to bring forward its common value of economics, ASEAN Economics Community, ASEAN Political Security Community, and ASEAN Social Cultural Community on how to build up another form of consensus, maintaining the sovereignty, maintaining the unity, maintaining the ASEAN team inclusivity and sustainability. However, it also started to push forward ASEAN into a new block of superpower regarding the middle power representation to move ASEAN into higher level of global player looking into all the regional peace and the global representative of ASEAN. And of course, strong ASEAN country. It was predicted, Farhan, that Indonesia and some other ASEAN country will be the next important economic player in the regions, in the global. And of course, this motivates ASEAN to work as a unity bloc, as a very united bloc in context of what we have the element today. And of course, it balances up the equilibrium between the superpower, the tensions of the war of tariff between the US and China, and of course it will affect ASEAN in the long-term foundations. And as some of ASEAN countries also started to be in the BRICS, and of course the recent integrations of Trump as president of US also will look into on how ASEAN have to be more strong and more fundamental in getting some similar strategic, economics, political, security consensus to make sure that ASEAN valuations, ASEAN independence, and not much dependence into the other elements of superpower in some certain context, economics, security, and maintaining their own blocks of security economic foundation based on this diplomatic capability, remaining the elements of the security, but moving forward into what's next the ASEAN can bring into regional stability and become the main dominant player in this region.
Right, Doctor. I think there's more to unravel, but we will take a short break, but stay with us as we will dive deeper into the topic, and stay with us right after this.
Apa signifikan dengan pengumuman ataupun berita yang keluar dari media China ini berkaitan dengan hasrat Malaysia untuk menyertai gabungan BRICS?
Kita mau dapat lebih banyak umpamanya pelaburan daripada negara China.
Kalau melihat kepada Akta Kanak-Kanak 2001, adakah kita terlalu lambat untuk melihat proses untuk meminda akta sedia ada?
Kita perlu ada penyelarasan. Kita tak mahu bekerja secara silo.
A brand new day, a brand new stadium.
Musim kedua, lebih mencabar, lebih hebat.
Kita dah compete 4 orang. So sekarang kita nak pergi mana ni?
Kita nak bawa korang ke tempat yang susah-susah orang nak masuk.
Perjalanan epik menyelami Premier League.
Today challenge is
cabaran demi cabaran menanti mereka.
Masa berjalan. Takkanlah saya nak kalah juga.
KDBS.
Setiap Khamis, jam 11 malam di Astro dan Astro Go.
Hi, welcome back to ASEAN Kita with me, Farhan Hakimi, and we were discussing about decoding the pillars of ASEAN with our guest, Dr. Nordin Mat Nordin, Security and Political Analyst at University Technology Mara UiTM Center for Media and Information Warfare Studies. Well, Doctor, let's take the European Union, EU, for instance. They have a common security policy that allows its members to take collective action. ASEAN, on the other hand, relies more on informal diplomacy and voluntary cooperation. So how does ASEAN's political security framework compare to the European Union's common foreign and security policy in terms of effectiveness and autonomy?
What is deemed as ASEAN's strength somehow can give a little bit of setbacks into ASEAN capability. If we look into some interesting global elements of organizations such as EU, they're most likely, or most of their binding elements, the elements of strategics, blueprint are basically binding with some certain acts. So this certain act can bring much forward into putting up responsibility. It has a legality elements, it carries a legal elements, the legal implications of what we call implications of what happens if some country breaches the elements of have been stated in the blueprint. For example, we look into the EU Artificial Intelligence Acts, EU Artificial Intelligence Blueprints, looking into EU Human Security Foundations elements. So this is something that binding the EU countries to really be serious in looking into these foundations when they are basically moving up into put up a strategy element. And EU always becoming a little bit of dominance comparing to the ASEAN in moving forward, because they need to maintain that disparity of the North-South element that have been looking into all the elementary of the diplomatic foreign policies and foreign affairs for the past decades in the world. So this is where ASEAN need to step forwards by reconsidering whether some certain elements of this interventions policy, some diplomatic, which is relevantly very good and have been proven and working so well till today, but where do ASEAN need to go next? Whether ASEAN need to deliberately looking into their legality element implications of legal that brings some certain what we call much more harsh and the hard and sticks element rather than looking the carrot hard and stick soft hard power rather than looking into the soft power mechanism that being happening in the ASEAN today. Again, you need some form of consensus. You need to look at the ASEAN are ready to move into these new implications of putting up some legal quandary, legal representations, legal implication about some certain thing breaches by some ASEAN representative, ASEAN organization, much of societies in ASEAN to really to bring ASEAN into another level. And of course, this is a big decision, Farhan. We have to be a bit much more of ASEAN consensus. Basically, I do agree into some certain element that ASEAN need to be in terms of putting some hard power. In fact, ASEAN might try to emulate what we have on the foundations of EU, United Nations, or rather the North Atlantic Treaty Organization. They have their own, not to say Security Councils at the United Nations, but they have a very structured representation to look into all the mechanisms. So this is basically a leader ASEAN, starting with Malaysia by 2025, our inclusivity and accessibility of Madani pillars being putting up in celebrations of ASEAN's motivation for the future and coming ASEAN next generations of leadership. So it is a consideration for me to put in that we have this beautiful element of human security, that making sure that all the elements of security in the context of ASEAN political security community to focus much more on the individual-centric rather than state security. So the Human Security Foundations, we relied under the official coordination of Internal Affairs and the United Nations and under the resolution 66290, if not mistaken, it's been gazetted in 2012 to look into the representations of this human security rather than look into the safety. So what are the list of the human security? Talk about food security, talk health security, environmental security, community security, individual security, and all the relevant security of individual centric, partly on the cyber security. So this is what makes the strong value of Human Security Foundation applied by United Nations to all the countries around the world. But ASEAN need to come up with their own form of terminology, their own definitions. What are the broader specific concepts of political community security? What are the elements of social cultural community, ASEAN economic community security? So the terminology, the theme of security have to be the new foundation of ASEAN, and it have to make sure that it carries some already little bits of legal implication, some hard carrot and stick approach, rather than looking to totally soft power approach that motivate ASEAN's establishment until today, Farhan.
And Doctor, if you look at it, ASEAN focuses on diplomacy and dialogue. But in cases like the South China Sea, some might argue that a stronger approach is needed to resolve conflicts in light of recent regional disputes. Should ASEAN evolve, beyond soft diplomacy and adopt a more robust dispute resolution mechanism? How can this be done?
I do like the question, Farhan, because as a political and security analyst looking into the regional and global conflict, of course, the Trump presidential will bring huge impact to the global perspective of governance. And he has redefined what security is all about, looking to the unilateral interests of the United States of America as the American president. However, looking into these considerations, the superpower elements that we have between US and China, of course, China dispute, which is gained a clause, which is supposed to be around 200, but nautical mile is supposed to be the regions or the things that permitted under that clause for us to look to, but China have claimed beyond of that, just because there's no certain form of specific boundary, specific hazards, and specific particular elements that blocks within their form of claim. So this is very wrong. However, when ASEAN talk about its form of military security, ASEAN form of disparity of technology, ASEAN form of disparity of countering the elements using much more robust military, it is a big step in ASEAN to look into the industrial military. And the concept of North and South, the military industrial complex have been surrounding ASEAN for quite some time. In fact, they are global power. If you look into the NATO establishment by itself, you could see that there are some guaranteed element that EU countries in the EU state must have diverged or what much we call the much more advanced technological in terms of military weapons and other devices more than the other country around the world. In fact, if we look into the establishment funded by X that called the QME, which is written as qualitative military aid, giving a significant boost by the US towards Israel to make sure that Israel have advantages over any form of defense security measurements in terms of technology, military advancement of weapon against all the Middle East countries. So this is what ASEAN need to think future ahead, to look into that, not looking that we are provoking into a form of harsh action, much work towards hard power, but the concepts of deterrence is important in ASEAN security. So ASEAN need to develop this deterrence for its military power, for its cooperation between the countries, not to form out what we call a military race among the ASEAN countries, but much more towards the collaborative effort. Looking into what the NATO have, looking into the EU regulation that we have, looking into the economic elements, much more the bigger blocks of context of ASEAN. So this is where ASEAN need to put its foot on to make sure that they have their own economic deterrence, they have their own form of military deterrence, security deterrence, to make ASEAN as also one of the regional players, one of the sustainability block of defense that can be sustained or can defend itself by its own form of military achievements, military capability, and cooperation between the ASEAN countries. So this will become an adding value towards ASEAN. Again, this is a big decision. This is something will not be liked by some form of superpower blocks, some of other blocks of countries, and it will motivate ASEAN to change its human security concept back toward the state security. So this hybrid concept of human security and security have to be looked into much more deeper comprehension perhaps in order ASEAN to move forward. And might be this ASEAN 2025, although this is quite very sensitive, provocative discussions that might become one of the global headline, but again, ASEAN have to make a decision. ASEAN have to have the equilibrium between the hard and soft power, looking back into its non-intervention policy, and strongly consider of putting up its own deterrence by increasing its capability to defend itself in form of dispute or conflict, particularly the South China Sea conflict that we have today.
Yeah, very intriguing. Well, if you look at many statements by the leaders in the region, ASEAN aims to create a single market where goods, services and investments flow freely, but economic gaps between countries like Singapore and Myanmar remain a major challenge. So, well, if you look at ASEAN Economic Community, AEC, envisions ASEAN as a single market, yet economic disparities persist among member states. So how does ASEAN ensure equitable development while maintaining market competitiveness?
Country like China, country like US, and most of European countries, they have the edge over this because they basically can become a little bit of independence and using the unilateral approach in promoting and expanding and of course increasing the valuations of GDP in the countries by looking into its self-sustainable economic values, and of course this can evolve in lots of tariff war between terms and the current tariff war between European countries, between US, Canada and China, proven that this thing can be a form of capability by all these regional power, superpower. They have the capability of the economic powerhouse. ASEAN do not have this. ASEAN still need to have the cooperations among the countries. ASEAN are basically dependent towards the FDI in form of countries. In fact, our countries and some of the countries really depending on the FDI to move forward to increase that form of economic growth in our country and to perform a good high form of economic growth and to reduce the inflation rates in the country. And this sustainability of ASEAN is a major thing that have to be looked into the ASEAN. It requires a new economic blueprint. ASEAN have it all, the single market, to promote ASEAN stability, but ASEAN need to move forward. For example, looking into the health security blocks by itself, because this health security is a very huge industry that we have today in the capability of ASEAN. If you look into the lesson learned that we learned in COVID-19 is how dependent we are into the vaccines, Pfizer's, Sinovac and all the types of the vaccine produced by all the other countries. ASEAN don't even have their own. Does it mean that ASEAN are left behind because of this somehow insustainability of ASEAN health security economics? So this might be one answer that ASEAN should have to dig out, to look into how to move forward regarding the powerhouse of Indonesia that basically are exploring the economics in very fast and dynamic trends, and might be one of the countries that we have to look forward to have a strong cooperation and leaderships in the ASEAN, because due to its numbers, capability, resources that have, and how the strategic cooperations in Malaysia, for example, looking into the context, the future of the element that we have in Sabah Sarawak, which is something that have to be taken care as a concept of Malaysia as unity value of nation, because the potential that we have in Sabah Sarawak to boost the economics of the ASEAN. And these representations have to be based by the strong diplomatic leadership of ASEAN consensus. Similarly, looking to the currently holding to the democratic value and looking to the ASEAN's identity, ASEAN exclusivity and sustainability, to make sure that the ASEAN promote good elements of to reduce the digital divide. It is ASEAN responsibility not to interfere into the other country form of sovereignty, but ASEAN responsibility to move the ASEAN blocks in a form of consensus, form of economics blocks in form of this security. So this will bring a new foundation in ASEAN by putting a mapping what is the core power of ASEAN economics. So if you look into some important decision that happens post World War II, when basically the France and the British have lost their financial power, so the US came out with the Marshall Plans by the President Truman during that particular time to look into the Marshall Plan. So basically, Marshall Plan do, it bail out European recovery by putting up the pegging everything's under the US dollar and bringing up the industrial element towards the US foundations as one of the major bailout towards the EU economics or most of the post-World War blocks of European power after the World War II have ended. So this is something that ASEAN have to look into that. So ASEAN need to have their own bailout. Might be similarly that we have a concept, IMF, World Bank, to look into the representation of this. So the bailout have to be structured into lots of other contexts. It might be looking into the agriculture, economic health security, cyber security, in fact, promoting much more investment into the health security. But we're not sure what will be the next potential disaster, the health security element threat that we might reach. So this is why that we have to have our own bailout by the superpower economic bloc in the context of ASEAN community, ASEAN country by itself.
Well, very insightful. Well, there's so much to unpack, but I think that's all the time we have. Well, thank you, Doctor. That was Dr. Nur Nurwandi Matnordin, Security and Political Analyst at the University Technology Mara UiTM Center for Media and Information Warfare Studies. Well, from strengthening political trust to driving economic resilience and fostering a deeper sense of regional identity, it's clear that these pillars are not just frameworks, but the very foundation of ASEAN's progress. That's all for ASEAN Kita. I'm Farhan Hakimi. Thank you for staying with us. See you again next time.
Di era digital, pemasaran bukan hanya tentang penjualan semata-mata. Penceritaan menarik jadi kekuatan dalam membina hubungan perniagaan, tingkat pengetahuan, perkasakan perniagaan anda. Saksikan segmen Jiwa SME dalam program Awani Pagi dan Niaga Awani setiap Isnin hingga Khamis di saluran 501. Dibawakan oleh penaja utama jelajah Jiwa SME, Unify Business, rakan digital pilihan anda.
Daulat Tuanku.
Kejahatan cuma wujud bila orang baik berdiam diri.
Iman tak salah.
Abah,
Kes terhadap Puan Zara digugurkan.
I know I feel. Kita belum kalah 300 juta.
Depan mata pun kau bagi lepas.
Aku tak ada niat nak bagi Jen kena tangkap.
One Cent Thief, Season 2. Stream episod baru setiap Jumaat on demand di Astro Citra dan Astro Go.
This is ranked top by almost 1/4 of respondents this year. And compare that to just 2 years ago, when it wasn't even in the top 10 of 2-year risks. This just shows how, unfortunately, the world has changed over the last couple of years. Over many, many years, environmental risks have topped 10-year risk outlook. But this year, we have 2 that have come into the top 10 in the short year outlook as well. Extreme weather events and pollution. And so I think this is perhaps a sign that the message is getting through, that this is, this has become a short-term crisis.
Men are actually the norm when it comes to clinical research, and this has led to fewer effective treatments, more side effects for women, and even less treatment available for women. And I can give you the example of endometriosis, where it actually affects 1 in 10 women globally. It takes approximately 10 years to receive a proper diagnosis, and still we don't have any cure available.
Equity is a fundamental principle of human rights between women and men, and if we don't have health equity, we live less healthy lives and have less well-being than men.
mean, there's all sorts of economic reasons why you unilaterally might want to impose tariffs, perhaps to expand your manufacturing sector, perhaps to generate additional jobs, perhaps to protect domestic industries, and so on. The problem is just that other countries have the same incentive also. So if I try to expand my manufacturing sector, for example, at your expense, and you try to expand yours at my expense, then at the end of the day, none of us has achieved their objective, and all we've done is increase prices for our consumers and also for our farms. One thing that I always say, particularly when you think about international trade, is not just about trade costs, it's not just about tariffs, but it's also about the expectation of what these trade costs and tariffs are going to be. Because if you as an investor now can't be sure what tariffs are going to be next year, what they're going to be in 5 years, that already today, even though nothing might have happened, is already going to affect your choices. One figure that most people don't know is that bilateral trade between China and the United States actually only accounts for less than 3% of world trade. So it generates 80% of the news, but only 3% of world trade, if you will. I think it's safe to predict that trade tensions between these two countries are going to persist. I think the key question is this going to spread to other countries, or is this going to be contained to that bilateral relationship? I think all of us would agree that the division of labor is an absolutely fundamental pillar of our prosperity. If I had to make all of my clothes, all of my food, all of my housing, all of my shelter, and so on by myself personally, clearly this would be a disaster. So what do? I specialize in something, you specialize in something, and we exchange. I think it stands to reason that this is the absolute fundamental pillar of our prosperity. Now, international trade is just an extension of this very basic idea across international borders. And why should the power of the division of labor stop just because there's an international border in the way? So I'm really hoping that policymakers also supported, influenced by business interests, by consumer interests, by civil society, will come to appreciate that we are all better off cooperating, and we are all better off trading than moving towards some sort of tit-for-tat situation that is going to leave all of us worse off.
Nursing is the biggest health profession, now close to 29 million nurses worldwide. But at the same time as being the largest, we also have a global shortage. So we have a gap between the supply of nurses and the demand for nurses, and that gap, we believe, is not only an issue for health, the status of population health, but also directly impacts on economic growth and economic recovery as well. It's my profession, and I've been there and worked clinically, and what I remember when I think back to my time working as a nurse, that a lot of the issues that I hear nurses talk to me about now, right the way around the world, are very, very similar, or indeed the same as they were many years ago. There's been estimates that up to 10% of global GDP can be impacted on by not getting care right in the first first place. Short staffing creates a risk for patients. It also puts pressures on nurses themselves. Poor working conditions. We have dreadful examples still of violence against nurses and other healthcare workers right the way around the world. Always a struggle to get decent, fair pay. 90% of the world's nurses are women, and that has absolutely played into lack of issues around promotion, pay, decent working conditions as well. These notions and concepts of it's a calling, it's a vocation. For some people it may be, but it is also a job, and nurses have rights as much as everybody else. Nurses, to coin a phrase, are ordinary people doing extraordinary work, and we need and we demand the support and the protection for them. One of the things I think that we should be doing, perhaps even a little bit more aggressively, is promoting nursing as an alternative career to people who are in sectors where technology may replace a lot of the human resources that we currently have as well. We absolutely should do more to promote nursing to men, not as an answer to the inequalities that have been historical and deeply ingrained. But for me, there's an equity argument there as well.
University Malaya UM is expected to offer a cardiothoracic specialist training course this October.
There will be no U-turn on the implementation of the Vehicle Entry Permit VEP for all foreign vehicles entering Malaysia from Singapore.
Diesel sales at petrol stations have decreased by 30% within the first week of the fuel subsidy rationalisation on June 10th.